You're watching News at Prime. Let's get into this conversation now. There are growing concerns over the rising death toll of South African soldiers in the conflict-ridden Eastern DRC. Last night, the South African National Defence Force confirming the death of a 14th South African soldier in the DRC conflict with rebels since the beginning of this year. This has prompted more calls for the withdrawal of South African soldiers. The latest deadly eruption of violence has seen South Africa and Rwanda at loggerheads, with Kigali accusing Pretoria of lying and distorting the facts. To discuss the latest developments, we're joined now by former Ambassador Lindiwe Zulu. Ms. Zulu, good evening to you, and thank you very much for your time. I'd like to start the conversation with the question about where for you did things go wrong between South Africa and Rwanda in the latest diplomatic tensions that we are seeing?
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I do have to start from condolences to the families of those that we lost. I am a former soldier myself, so I know what it is to be there. And having been in the DRC also many a times, including that Goma itself, I know what it is for the soldiers there. However, I would like us to not only just focus on the conflict or the contradictions that might be happening between South Africa and Rwanda. I think we do need to make the statement that the relationship between Rwanda and South Africa from a bilateral point of view, government to government, has been going on quite well. But obviously, the recent conflict that has now escalated, because we mustn't forget that this is a long way back, as way back as the late 90s, 1999. You will recall, because I know you guys do a lot of research, you will recall that there was the Lusaka Agreement that was signed in 1999. What was it dealing with? It was dealing with exactly the same thing we are dealing with today in terms of Rwanda and the DRC. It was dealing with the withdrawal of the Rwandan forces from the DRC. There was a third-party verification mechanism which was set up between the United Nations, South Africa, signed by President Thabo Mbeki. I was one of those people that had to go to the DRC at the time to ensure the implementation of that Lusaka Agreement.
You invoke the name of former President Thabo Mbeki. He has been speaking, and speaking specifically about what he calls the Sun City Agreement, and which agreement was never, quote-unquote, repudiated, according to him. So why has this failed to basically be implemented?
The first issue we need to deal with is the political will, in my view. When agreements are signed, they are signed with what purpose? I'm taking you back to the third-party verification mechanism because that one had an implementation plan. And that implementation plan had to be monitored. Hence, we had the third-party verification mechanism that was meant to, yes, there is that implementation. Rwanda knows what it has to implement. DRC knows what it has to implement. But there had to be a mechanism that makes sure that there is a monitoring and evaluation of that implementation. Now, if you have any other agreements that are signed and they are not being monitored and checked as to whether they are being implemented properly or not, we will then continuously have the challenge we have today.
I want to move us along swiftly because we don't have much time. The tensions, I'm going back to the tensions between South Africa and Rwanda. Do you think these are going to be ironed out or can be resolved, or will they have to wait for the SADC region meeting its East African region, and therefore after that will there be a possible cooling of these tensions?
That tension we cannot afford, quite frankly, if we look at the bigger picture of what SADC's responsibility is, and what the government of the DRC's responsibility is, and what Rwanda's responsibility is. So any tension of any form, any words that might be thrown left, right, and center by one or the other to other is not going to help the situation. The situation is going to be held by one, South Africa and Rwanda. That is the two presidents, as they or actually have been engaging with each other. We saw all the nice pictures that came through when they had a conversation. We've got to go back to that drawing board and have the presidents speaking to each other, and have the ministers of foreign affairs speaking to each other, and have the countries speaking to each other, because quite frankly, if we don't focus on stopping that war, and if we don't focus on the impact of that war on the people of the Eastern DRC, I've been there, I've seen it. I know what it is for women and children to be running with miserable possessions on their backs, running from the sound of gunfire. That's what we need to focus on.
You speak about that terrain. I want to get into that very quickly. Do you think, though, that the two regions can meet and really have a thoroughgoing discussion if Rwanda has, as it has done today, has put out a statement rejecting what it says are allegations that come from the resolution of this extraordinary SADC summit that has just taken place, and it specifically defends its defense force, the Rwandan defense force, saying that they do not threaten civilians?
We've been here before, and that's why I'm saying lessons learned from the past, and lessons learned actually from the withdrawal of Rwanda itself. And I speak not from hearsay. The day that the withdrawal was happening, I was in Goma. We were all in a big stadium. We saw the forces withdrawing. And so when I say we must learn from the past, it is for real. However, as I said earlier on, war of words are not going to help anybody. It is important for the leaders to have the political will, number one. And number two, there's got to be honesty in this whole conflict that is happening. All role players must be brought around the table. Kicking and screaming, whatever the situation, we as South Africa have always believed a solution to a conflict or a war will always be a resolution. It'll always be resolving the conflict through peaceful means. And therefore, Rwanda, you must also understand where Rwanda comes from. When you've been through a genocide, when you've seen all that has happened and so many people killed, you will obviously stand up to try and defend yourself. But at the same time, it is important to realize that there's a lot of goodwill that needs to be harnessed. Yeah. And the goodwill cannot be harnessed by strong words that are thrown at each other.
You talk about Goma, and I would like for you to take us to that terrain. And the reason I'm doing that is that South African soldiers died in that terrain on the 23rd of January.
Yes.
We're now sitting in the first week of February. Should South African soldiers, should their remains have been returned to South Africa by now?
Yes, the remains should be returned, but you must also appreciate that that's a very difficult terrain. I don't think anyone has actually, no, not that anyone. I think a lot of people who've tried to find out where exactly did this happen, where did they die. That terrain is not an easy terrain. It's a very difficult terrain. But at the same time, there are certain due processes that we also must consider. Between South Africa, SADC, the United Nations and all, because it's all these people involved. We don't want a situation where you bring the soldiers back home and you bring bodies back home and then suddenly we are finding, because remember, by the way, it's not only South Africans who are there. We are talking about our own because we have our national interest, but there are other countries that are also participating here. So unfortunately, the protocols and the bureaucracies of doing that, unfortunately for us, take long. And I feel, obviously, for the families, because the sooner the bodies are brought back, the sooner they have closure, even though there'll never be closure. I don't think it's easy closure when you lose your child, because for the parents and the families, it's not a soldier, it is their child. That's what matters.
There are suggestions that part of the reason the remains of South African soldiers have not come back to South Africa is that these soldiers are surrounded by the M23 rebels, and therefore an agreement has got to be made by them to be given a safe passage. Let's start with the allegations around our soldiers possibly being surrounded or held hostage. Do you believe that that could be the reality and perhaps the delay, or explains the delay?
No, I don't believe that, because, you know, our army is a very professional army, first and foremost. There might be issues about, you know, they don't have enough of this and enough of that, but I can tell you I have confidence in the Army of South Africa, because if that was a fact, I think we would have been told exactly by then. Remember, there was this little video that was doing the rounds, and the white flag coming out. I think the defense people did explain that. And also, there are operational matters which I suppose belong to them that they have to explain, but I do not think that they are unable to bring the remains because of that. By the way, Xoli, let me tell you, returning of remains from anywhere, it's a long process. Even if somebody were to die of natural causes and all, the embassy in a given country has to go through a long process. They even have to go to the mortuary and make sure that everything is processed properly. I think those are operational matters, obviously, but I do not think that the M23 is now holding us hostage. Remember, the defense also did say that part of the reason why they had to raise it is because the other side also needed to retrieve their own. You know, there are military protocols that some people might not necessarily understand, but it's important for the military then to be able to communicate. The generals must be able to communicate and refute what you are saying right now, because personally, from my legal experience, I don't think that is the situation.
You have said right at the start of this interview that you understand the issues. You have been to Goma on the ground. I'd like to conclude this interview with the remarks that were made by the former Rwandese general, Kayumba Nyamwasa. You're seated right here today. And he says the DRC conflict has long been about the minerals in the east of that country. Do you go along with what he says? And looking closely, do you think that South Africa may have allowed itself to basically become involved in the conflict between Rwanda and Congo without really putting its mind into it, without closely monitoring?
We've never not put mind to what we do. Least of all, anything that is related to conflict and the deployment of our soldiers. We do not do that without thinking about it over. I agree with him. That is the problem in terms of the minerals, because you'd ask yourself the question, why isn't that happening somewhere else? We all are aware of the strategic resources that are in that area. We are aware of the gold and everything that is there. We are aware, obviously, that there are South Africans that have an interest, because South Africans, we have a national interest. What is our national interest? Our national interest, firstly, is to ensure that we protect ourselves as South Africa, we grow our own economy. So business will go to the DRC and look for those opportunities. Business will go everywhere to look for those opportunities. However, in the process of looking at those opportunities, we have said we have to be conscious of the fact that peace must prevail, development must be everywhere. It can't be development in South Africa and no development in the DRC. And as I conclude, for me, it's the political will of our leaders, is the implementation of resolutions that they take, and is the consistency thereof.
Lindiwe Zulu, former ambassador, thank you very much for your time.